The honourable member. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I give the call to the honourable member for Griffith.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. This is a very important bill because it is a fact that for many, many years there's been a lot of contest in relation to copyright law in Australia, and that will remain the case after this bill is passed. But nonetheless, this bill goes some way to advancing the cause of those who would like to see rights holders protected, but also copyright laws that are fit for purpose in the 21st century. We're very fortunate in this country to have a great start-up ecosystem, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's something that I've certainly taken a very strong interest in the entire time that I've been here in the Parliament. In fact, the now Speaker and I established this Parliament's bipartisan Parliamentary Friends of Innovation and Enterprise back in 2014, and I remain the co-convener of that important group. Mr Speaker, we have, in the course of the work that we have done in that bipartisan Friends group, really met with a lot of people who are in that ecosystem, whether that's individual startups, Startup Australia, Startup Oz, universities, venture capitalists, angel investors, obviously a whole range of people in the ecosystem, incubators, accelerators, whether run for-profit, not-for-profit, by universities, by community. And a number of those players, those participants in the startup ecosystem in this country, obviously have a very strong interest in making sure that in innovating, in creating new products and services for people to use, whether it's for domestic use or for export, they do not inadvertently run afoul of Australia's copyright laws. And of course, you can imagine, Deputy Speaker, that there are lots of different ideas, different applications involving the use of material that may be copyrighted. I say maybe because it's not even always clear what is copyrighted. And so that group has heard from a number of people in respect of their concerns about Australia's copyright laws and how dated some people consider them to be. We've certainly had some very good bipartisan and, I have to say, robust discussions about a related issue, not this issue, but the fair use exemption that's sought by some stakeholders. There are people who are very strongly for the creation of such an exemption. There are people who are very strongly against it because they worry about what that will mean for the erosion of their rights in the intellectual property that they have created and owned. And everyone in this place, I think, would agree that it is important to have very strong intellectual property rights. It's never been as important as it is now to have strong intellectual property rights. The enforcement and creation of rights incentivises innovation, it incentivises economic activity. If you know that you won't be able to actually enforce your rights, then you lose a fair bit of the incentive to create the IP in the first place. And so it is important that we have a very strong intellectual property regime, and it's also equally important that in making sure that that regime exists, that we consider the interests of both producers and consumers when it comes to the use of products and services that are created. Labor has traditionally been the party that seeks to protect the interests of consumers. Consumers often have less power in a market than producers do. We have some landmark consumer protection legislation against our name, obviously the Whitlam Government's Trade Practices Act, and of course during the Rudd-Gillard years, the Consumer and Competition Law 2010. We're interested in what can be done to redress some of the power differentials between consumers and producers. In copyright, you really have to conceptualise it as an issue of consumers and producers. The market for complicated goods, for new services, is after all just a market. Even though the goods and services may feel unfamiliar to us, the new technologies are unfamiliar to us, it's still a market, and so in that market you will still have power imbalances. And so when we talk about copyright law, it sounds like it might be something quite dull, really, doesn't it, copyright law? But actually it's fascinating, because copyright law is what seeks to strike the legal balance between the competing interests and rights of the people who produce content and the people who consume content. You might consume it as a kind of an end user, a kind of a retail consumer, or you might consume content from a production perspective, a value chain perspective. Content might be an input into a new product or service that you create through the addition of value. And for people in that latter class, it's important that we do think about how copyright laws work. So, that, as I said, they're not inadvertently caught up in copyright laws, but also so that more broadly, you can have the protection of rights without stifling innovation, creativity and economic activity. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because it's really an intermediate good content when looked at from that perspective. It's not a final use good. And so how do you ensure that when there is a process of value creation, value addition, that there's not unreasonable constraints, unreasonable restraints on that economic activity, because that's not in anyone's interest. And so I always try to take a strong interest in copyright law from an innovation perspective. Of course, I'm also an end user of content. I've been known to listen to music. I've been known to read books occasionally, not as often as I might like. I'm sure as many of us here would say. I see the member for Swan smiling at that proposition. He's a bit sceptical that I read books. A bit sceptical. But you know, as a retail end user of content, we also want to make sure that there's not regulation that causes difficulty in gaining access or puts constraints or restraints that are unreasonable, but at the same time I think most users in Australia want to pay their fair share for the use of copyrighted material. It's interesting, isn't it, that people are starting to learn about the importance of making a fair payment for content. You know, people whose favourite TV show got cancelled because everyone was downloading it illegally instead of paying to watch it. They learn about the value of paying your fair share to use copyrighted material, and so it is when we come to any legislation that might seek to amend the copyright laws of this country. And Deputy Speaker, this bill, I think, really does strike at the heart of the second of the two main issues that continuously come up in our discussions in our Enterprise and Innovation Group, and that's safe harbour. Should there be a safe harbour protection for people who use copyrighted materials, maybe inadvertently, again, using them without the correct permissions, without the correct arrangements in place? Or should there be a safe harbour for people who use materials of which they just don't know the provenance? They are using a material that they don't know who the author is or the producer or the creator. How do you actually reconcile all these competing interests? Well, this particular bill that we're dealing with here would extend the operation of the safe harbour scheme that's set out in the existing legislation to a broader range of service providers. And it's a fairly non-controversial foray into safe harbour reform. There certainly would be controversy if the bill were looking at a much broader version of safe harbour than this bill does, but this bill, given its particular terms, seems to have broadly a broad consensus and broad support across the stakeholder groups. And of course Labor consults stakeholder groups, as I'm sure the government does as well. And Deputy Speaker, this bill is generally supported by producers, by rights holders and their peak bodies, because it provides a social good without undermining their commercial interests, and also doesn't undermine their capacity to negotiate effectively with commercial enterprises for the distribution of their copyright materials. And of course that's good because, and important to them, because one of the fears that I think you hear a lot of when discussing safe harbour or fair use in the context of innovation is that small producers without much power, vis-a-vis massive multinational corporations that might want to use your content to help develop machine learning or new applications that haven't been previously thought of, you know, you might feel pretty powerful as a producer compared to an end user, a retail user, consumer, but do you feel powerful up against a multinational technology firm? Perhaps not. And so they don't want to lose their bargaining power either. They don't want to lose their ability to negotiate. And so it is important that we consider that in any copyright reform, and this bill certainly does consider that and is not a... I think people are happy with it because they don't perceive it as eroding their power and their ability to get a fair day's pay for the work that they've put into creating the content that they've created. And Deputy Speaker, I think this bill should be supported because it strikes those balances, incorporates those sets of interests, and it should also be supported as a step along the path of really looking at what needs to be done to modernise our copyright laws in this country. And as I said, this one's fairly non-controversial because it's actually about taking the rights of rights holders and the interests of educational and cultural institutions, and then providing the extended benefits under the Safe Harbour scheme to try to better balance those two sets of interests. And I say it's fairly non-controversial because the entities that will benefit from this particular legislation don't actually benefit financially from their use of the copyright material. It's a different situation to a big tech firm using it to create a commercial product or commodity. But that's not the case with this bill, and so this one particularly can be fairly non-controversial. And the founding principle for this bill is that passive carriers with no control over the material carried on internet services shouldn't be liable for copyright infringement, provided they take steps to remove infringing content when they're notified of its use. So the scheme is you put something up, you don't know that it's a copyright infringement, the rights holder gets in touch, you take it down, no liability, that's the idea. Whereas if you're then obstinate and refuse to take down someone else's material, obviously that would be a very different proposition. And this bill will help schools, it'll help universities, it will help libraries, it will help cultural institutions to operate efficiently without having to have that constant worry hanging over them about the inadvertent breach of copyright legislation. It's very important that we do acknowledge that there's a lot of burdens carried by our educational and cultural institutions when it comes to the use of material. I've certainly had school librarians and university librarians come and see me about these exact issues, because the school might pay a lot of public monies towards the copyright agencies to pay for fees for copyright for works that you might not even know the author of. In one case, those fees were going into a fighting fund against copyright law reform, an issue that gave a lot of people some cause for concern, and certainly is an issue that's been discussed in the halls of this building a little bit as well. But I think it's worth noting, Deputy Speaker, that those school librarians, those university librarians aren't there advocating out of personal interest. They're advocating because they actually want to see the end to the waste of public money that's spent on trying to, one, manage the copyright regime, and two, pay fees to people that we don't even know who they are and can't track them down. So I think it's really a great step forward for those educational institutions, and the same goes for cultural institutions as well. But I did want to make the point that we can't just stop with this bill. And I know the other parts are much harder. I know the reconciling of commercial interests between producers, retail consumers and value adders, people for whom the product is seen as an intermediate good rather than a final good, it's not an easy thing to balance and reconcile those competing interests. I think we can articulate, though, what we want the principles to be. One, we want thriving domestic production of artistic, cultural, creative works, works in which there are copyright. Two, we don't want unnecessary burdens on schools and cultural institutions, something that this bill deals with. And three, we also don't want unnecessary impediments on firms, on enterprises that are seeking to create new goods. And the fact is, information is a resource as well as something that isn't end in itself. It's also a resource. We have to find ways to really look at what firms like Redbubble are doing, other Australian firms that are content users, and say, do we want to have a country where we have innovation, where enterprising people can generate economic activity, and we can have the interests of producers taken strongly into account and the bargaining power of producers not eroded? Are there ways to reconcile those principles? I don't claim to have the answers to all of these questions, of course. These are complicated questions. I certainly don't have a dog in the fight of we look after producers more or tech firms more or consumers more, but I do think all of those interests need to be taken into account, because we do have a very a very big opportunity before us with our innovation ecosystem. We do have the skills. We do have, we're an advanced economy. We've got great skills. We've got great people. We're a wealthy nation comparatively in world terms. We have this opportunity to really take our innovation ecosystem and use it. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I thank the honourable member.